Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Ask Kati Anything. I'm your host, licensed marriage and family therapist, Kati Morton. I'm so glad that you're here. I want to give you a heads up that this is the second to last regular AKA that we're going to have. I have let you guys know we're going to revamp the podcast, do more interviews, get to learn from people who've been there before and had a tough time on their own. We're also going to talk to, specialists and experts in the field, as well as other creators and celebrities and people who have had their own struggles. So we will have this podcast and then one more, and then we're going to take a break to revamp. So just as a heads up. But today I'm going to talk about why we can have a hard time believing that we're not a horrible person, where that can come from. Then I'm going to dig into the effects of having a sibling who has their own mental health issues and what it really means to quote unquote get better. Then I'll also explain what it means to have a nervous breakdown, and finally, how to cope with emotionally immature parents. Without further ado, let's jump into this first question. This question says, Kati, I have a really hard time believing that I'm not a horrible person. My therapist asks me why I can't accept the good things about myself, but I just can't. It isn't that I want to continue to think shitty thoughts about myself. I just can't break them. How do I do that? I worry that I'm going to push my therapist away because I can't seem to break those beliefs about myself. I fear I'm wasting her time. For context, I have complex PTSD, was emotionally neglected, parentified, and have a narcissistic parent, on top of other trauma. Thank you for all you do and for answering our questions. Of course, happy to be here. To say that I'm not surprised there's trauma in your past would be an understatement, because what you're talking about here is shame. When we believe that we're broken, that we're horrible, that something's wrong with us, that we're like inherently bad in some way, those are all shame thoughts. Now, remember, shame is not, I've done something wrong. Shame is not, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Shame is something's wrong with me, that I am broken in some way. And shame often accompanies trauma or a PTSD response, because think about it this way. If we grew up, like you said, you had a narcissistic parent, you were parentified and you were emotionally neglected. So we didn't grow up feeling cared for, seen, heard, or understood. Instead, we grew up having the people who were supposed to love and care for us instead do us harm. And when that happens, we try to make sense of it. And as a kid, we look around, we're like, why would this happen? These are the people I'm supposed to turn to for help. Even though we might not realize we're doing this, unconsciously, we're looking to try to explain it. And when we don't have any information other than the fact that the one who's supposed to love us is actually hurting us, we blame it on ourselves. We assume that we must be the problem because we can't come up with another option, right? There is no sense to be made out of it, right? You can't give us an explanation as to why it's happening. Therefore, we blame the only person we know the best, and that's us. And so growing up, we think, I must have done this. I should have been better. I shouldn't have said that. I should have got better grades. I shouldn't have made so much noise. Whatever. I should have, coulda, woulda. We blame ourselves for all of the abuse and neglect and whatever took place. And abuse is neglect, by the way, but just putting them together first so you can understand that that's why we have these shame thoughts, because we blame all of the abuse we sustained on ourselves. And I believe the reason that we do this is really so that we can try to make sense of it as best as we can, because our brain likes to try to understand why harm is happening. And then we try to survive through it. And if we blame ourselves, then we can beat ourselves up and feel like, oh, okay, I'm taking care of it. It won't happen again. I'm making sure that I know better, that I won't do this. And so we keep moving forward that way. Unfortunately, because that's not the truth and it's not our fault, that shame doesn't really get us anywhere. It just erodes our self-esteem, makes us feel really badly about ourselves. And because we can't control other people, the abuse could continue to happen, because it doesn't matter how much we shit on ourselves. If we have a narcissistic parent or a parent who's emotionally unavailable, that's going to continue to happen. The abuse is going to continue to happen because that's what they're doing. And we don't have control over them. And so that's why it's hard for you to stop believing that you're a horrible person. It's not because you are a horrible person. I want you to know that I, even without meeting you, already know that you are not a horrible person. But that's the story that you've told yourself as you've gone through all of these different abusive scenarios, and that's born out of the shame that accompanies PTSD or trauma as a whole. Now, that's just an explanation, but the way that we break through, the way that we kind of undo these shame thoughts is truly to start talking about, which it sounds like you probably are, but start talking about and processing the trauma. Now, what that means, because we say that a lot, talking about it and processing it, whatever modality of therapy you are practicing with your therapist, meaning is it just talk therapy where you're talking it through? That means we're going to talk about the trauma until it doesn't have any emotional charge behind it. We essentially talk about what happened, gain insight from our therapist. We're challenged to think about something maybe in a different way or talk about it in more detail until we feel like, you know what, that happened, but it doesn't have to define me now. We can kind of just let it go. And it doesn't mean that we aren't hurt by it or we don't acknowledge the pain that we sustained, but we don't allow the pain to continue today. Okay? So there's that. We could be doing somatic experiencing where we like move the trauma through our bodies, getting that energy that was queued up kind of pushed out. It could mean we do more schema therapy or internal family systems like parts work where we allow the different parts of ourselves to be seen and heard and understood. Whatever it is, we're doing that. That's part of that processing or working it through so that our trauma doesn't have to define us or affect us today. By doing that, the shame, thoughts, and beliefs about self will slowly go away. Now, I wish that I had a better answer where I'm like, do X, Y, Z, and presto, you will not think you're horrible anymore. But unfortunately, it takes time. But be patient with yourself. Your therapist is not going to be pushed away. They are used to things like this, beliefs about self being difficult to crack, being difficult to challenge. As long as you're trying your best, that's all we can do in therapy. And your best might be, hey, I can't do this. This is too much. That homework was too much. I don't know. I still do think I'm terrible. That's still like part of your process. So do not worry. Your therapist is not going to get pushed away. This takes time to untangle. It took years for this belief to take hold and to grow its roots. So it's going to take a little bit of time for us to pull it out and to kind of eradicate it from ourselves. So give yourself time and patience. You're doing the best that you can, and it will slowly but surely, as you process through the trauma, those beliefs will go away. Okay. Moving on to question number 2. This question says, hi, Kati, could you talk about the effects on the sibling of someone both the same age who has struggled with severe self-harm for years and suicide attempts, nonviolent and luckily not successful? For example, the trauma and what that could look like for the sibling who witnessed everything. The quote unquote mental preparation for believing that they're going to someday be successful at their suicide attempt. The core beliefs formed from it all. The neglect due to high needs sibling, etc. Any and all thoughts on the effects and anything else you can think of would be so appreciated. Thanks for all that you do, Kati. Now, there was a comment, and I'm going to read this one first. There's 2 more, but this one actually ties in directly. And it says, as an add-on, can it affect the person who's struggling when they know a sibling knows? Oh, and then we'll get into the other ones later. So the effects of having a sibling with high needs, there's a lot to unpack here. Let's start with the fact that if we have a sibling in general who has any higher needs than what I would say like a neurotypical kid does or a regular child needs, meaning maybe they had a bunch of surgeries, maybe they needed some extra like speech therapy, maybe they, I don't know, had to have a neck brace or a back brace because of scoliosis, so they had to go to all this like PT or I don't know. They needed something extra, or mental health support. They're suicidal, they have self-injury urges. Whatever the case, when a sibling needs more support than the other siblings, whether it's one or many, it doesn't even matter. And if we're same age, it doesn't matter. What this really does to us is it means that the sibling who doesn't need as much extra support gets neglected. And I don't say this to be like, it's 100% going to happen and parents can't, balance the scales. Without realizing it, most parents, I'd say 99% of the time, are unable to give that amount of attention to both children or to all of their children, frankly, because the one is needing more of that time and appointments and schedules and things and having homework stuff to do at home. And the parent may have to help them, take them to gymnastics to practice this or to their physical therapy or occupational therapy or speech therapy or whatever it is. There's a bunch of appointments and a bunch of things and maybe extra things at school. All of that is going to pull the time and energy away from the other child or children in that family. And so emotional neglect is usually incredibly common. And I find the children of a high needs, like the sibling of high needs children, will most likely be super type A, perfectionistic, feeling like they have to earn love and support, and honestly become kind of like A parentified child, potentially, but more so like very independent, like toxically independent, do everything on their own because they kind of had to. And we often internalize this belief that like I'm not enough as is to get the attention and love and support that I need. So I'm going to work extra hard to try to get that. So that's one route. Or we can take the other route where we kind of become, and I don't mean to use this term as like a put down or anything, but like more of a delinquent. Like they're not going to see me anyways. I'm going to numb out because I feel neglected and hurt. So I'm going to drink or do drugs or, engage in other risky and dangerous behaviors because nobody cares about me. And so I don't care about me. And so those are kind of the two paths that can happen. Now, in this specific question, we're talking about self-harm and suicide attempts. That in and of itself is trauma. The fact that you try to mentally prepare yourself for the belief that maybe one day they will take their own life and they will succeed at unaliving themselves, right? That's overwhelming. That is traumatizing. That's really painful. And so not only could we have the trying to be like type A and like overly perfectionistic or kind of being more of a delinquent path. Like not only can we have that reaction to this, but we may also, feel that the trauma experience of someone we love hurting and seeing them hurt and want to hurt themselves and worrying that we might find them dead in the house or they might be successful in one of their attempts. And that's so painful. And so there's a lot going on here for you. And I believe those are kind of like the ripple effects of this. And then you said the core beliefs form from it all. I think that I'd have to dig into it more for what it means for you. But I think a lot of those core beliefs have to do with the fact that maybe we think like we're not good enough. So because we haven't gotten the same amount of attention, or it could be more about like, I'm not important enough for them to stick around. We can struggle with like self-esteem as a result. There's a lot that could come from it. And I mean, those are really the effects. I know that's kind of just what you just want me to talk about, the effects of it. Now, the question about how it affects the person struggling if they are aware that their sibling knows about it, I think that just kind of layers on the guilt for anybody who's felt like they're such in a dark, lonely place that they feel like taking their life as the only option. To think that you might harm someone else emotionally, or that this might hurt them, or maybe they've told you it hurts them and I wish you'd stop doing this to yourself. That only layers on. I'm not saying like, don't say that. I mean, it's not helpful, but I know it's not done with, malicious intent, but it just layers on that guilt and that kind of depressive thought, like nobody wants me here. I'm only making things worse for other people. It kind of feeds into what we already believe about ourselves. And so I think when you're the one struggling, knowing that it's affecting those around you only makes it worse. And there's no real way out of that other than for you to get help, because this is honestly kind of what I would call like the suicide cycle, where we feel so shit and so hopeless and helpless that we consider, taking our own life. And in doing that and attempting or even talking about it, those in our life say, this is so hard for me. You really hurt me. I can't believe you wouldn't want to be here for me. And then we feel worse again. And then it starts all over. And in order to kind of stop that cycle from continuing, we need to get professional help. And so if you are the one that is struggling, I cannot encourage you enough to reach out for a therapist in your area. Maybe go into treatment for a month or two, maybe do a day program. Take that time for yourself, because it will always be worth it. You are worth it. It can get better. I know you can't believe it, but let somebody else spark that light in this dark hole that you're in to show you that there is a way out and that it can improve. Now, there were other comments on this as an add-on, if this relates, can you talk about how witnessing a sibling being physically abused impacts you? Then in turn, how being abused by that sibling impacts you. I was bullied a lot outside of the home. My sibling joined in on that. But they were also physically and verbally abusive within the home. I understand they had a lot of big emotions and I was an easy target, but I still wonder how all of this impacted how I view myself. Any kind of abuse happening, or even witnessing abuse happen to a sibling in your home, is all trauma. Remember, to be traumatized, we have to fear for our own life or safety, or the life and safety of someone else. Okay? And so, especially if this is our sibling, the closer the emotional connection with that person, the more traumatizing it can be for us. All of this is trauma. And trauma does erode at our self-esteem, because if someone who is close to us, like a sibling, I'm not saying that we look to siblings and think, oh, you should be like my caretaker. Sometimes we could, if we had an older sister or brother who was the one that always like helped us when we were growing up. But at the very least, they're family, and we don't expect them to hurt us in that way. And so when someone who's supposed to love us and be part of our family harms us, that is not only traumatizing, but it also makes us feel like something's wrong with us. Why wouldn't they love us, right? Like I talked about earlier, we take that story, we try to make sense of it. We blame ourselves. Maybe if I wasn't so loud, like they told me, or so annoying, maybe they wouldn't have done that. We can really start to question ourselves and how we relate with the world. And it can cause us to kind of pull everything inside and feel like we can't be ourselves. We can't show who we are, because that's how we get hurt. And I think, trauma from watching it happen, and then trauma from it happening to us, whether it's inside the home or outside the home, it doesn't really matter. It's abuse and trauma all the same. Okay. Now there was a final add-on. It said, I've been in therapy for years, but I struggle to talk to my siblings about the abuse from our childhood. Any ideas how to open up that conversation? I mean, it depends on what you're trying to get out of it. Siblings can be a great resource for us, like checking facts. If we have repressed memories and we're like, did that really happen? Is this really what happened? We can ask them for some clarification. Be like, oh my God, I had this memory pop up about blank, blank, blank. Do you remember that? And they can be the one to be like, oh yeah, but did you remember, like my brother's done this for me for like little memories that I've recalled. He's like, oh my God, though, do you remember this though? And I'm like, oh, I totally forgot about that. He's almost 4 years older than me. So when I'm younger and I'm like, did we go camping at this place? He's like, yes. And then remember that deer ran through our camp, and I like don't remember all. And I'm like, oh yeah, because he was a little bit older. His memories are more clearly formed often. And also he's a different person. So he has a different recollection of the event, and things that I remember, he might not remember. So we can use siblings in that way. But when it comes to opening up a conversation about abuse from childhood, I find it best to start slow, because we don't know if they're even acknowledging that it was abuse and it's happened, if they're open to even talking about it. And we don't want to like force them into a re-traumatization by making them talk about something that maybe they're not ready for. So the first way to open it is to start talking about the fact that you're in therapy and see how they respond. Mention, because you can do it lightly. We can start by light conversations saying like, because stuff when we were growing up was pretty tough. Kind of what I'd call like a glaze over, or like a drive-by of a tough situation. We just skirt the issue a little bit to see how they respond. Because we can definitely like push a conversation forward, but I don't always think that's best, because they may not be ready to have the conversation, so they can say, no, that didn't happen. They can kind of like not only deter us from our own therapeutic process, but even kind of gaslight us into thinking maybe that didn't happen. They can also like shut down, or they can lash out, right? So we want to do these kind of drive-by things just to see if they're like, oh my God, yeah. And then if they want to engage in the conversation, they will. Or if they're not ready, they might say, yeah, that was rough, and change the subject. Or they might be like, what are you talking about? Therapy? I would never get into therapy. And that tells us all we need to know. But that gives us an idea of how to try to start the conversation and see where they're at. Because unfortunately, we can't control other people. We can only control ourselves. And we can't force people to have conversations with us about things they don't want to talk about. But we can try to open that door and see how they respond. So try a drive-by. Try like yeah, I've been in therapy, because growing up, like, things were rough, or yeah, dad wasn't the best, or, mom could be pretty difficult, and I'm trying to like untangle that. And they might be like, oh my God, me too. I've been in therapy for years. That's like a green light into the conversation. Or if they're like, yeah, it was pretty tough. Like, I haven't had anyone. Let's talk about something different, and then you get that where they're at, but they're not completely shut down, but they're a little shut down. So do those drive-bys just to see where they're at. And I feel like that's kind of your way to try to get in and see if the conversation is one that can be had. Okay. Moving on to question number 3. This question says, hey, Katie, this is a weird question. I'll be the judge of that. But I'm not asking for the specifics. When we say it eventually will get better, what is the broad definition of quote unquote get better? The thing is, it is true that it relatively got better, but it's still so hard. And some aspects become harder. I started to feel like I'm in a loop where every time I feel like I'm at the end of my rope now, then there's more. And I'm losing my patience, and it's terrifying. This is a great question. It's not weird at all. Getting better simply means that it's better than the day before or the week before or the month before. We're not comparing ourselves to anybody else. We're not saying I have to feel X, Y, or Z in order to be better. We're saying that I'm better today than I was yesterday, because the only thing we can compare ourselves to is ourselves from before. Okay? I want you to hear that. The only thing we can compare ourselves to is us from yesterday or us from 5 minutes ago. We so often want to look out and be like, I want that life, or I want to feel that way. That's always going to leave us feeling lesser than or worse than. It's my favorite quote, comparison is the thief of joy, right? So when we talk about getting better, that means that we feel a little bit better today than we did yesterday. And so overall in therapy, when we say like, it will get better, it can get better, that means that the things that are affecting you today won't be affecting you then. Now, what is then? Could be a week, could be a month, could be a year, could be years. But little by little, things will incrementally get better. And so I know you feel like you're in a loop, like you get at the end of your rope and then there's more. I am curious about the treatments that you're receiving. Are we on medication? Are we in therapy? Because some aspects, when we are getting better, do get hard. For example, in the work that I've done in my own personal life, therapy has opened my eyes to some ways that I engage or like communicate that I don't like. Like I could be really reactive. When I was younger, I used to be incredibly stubborn. I'm still a little stubborn, but like more reactive, more angry. I didn't realize I was angry because I was sad and I didn't allow myself to really express either. And so it would just build up and then I'd explode. Okay. So in therapy, I learned to have difficult conversations, to say like, I'm scared that you're upset about this, or I'm worried about that, or I'm angry because you hurt my feelings. That made me mad, right? Whatever the thing, I didn't feel like I could communicate it. And so my work in therapy was to start communicating that. And that was fucking hard. And so when you say some aspects get harder, yeah, that's the work. But I found, and I don't know if you feel this way too, that in doing that work and acting in a different way in the hopes of a better outcome, I do feel better. Uncomfortable at first, and then better in the end. And then uncomfortable, and then better. And then the discomfort gets less and less, and it gets easier and easier for me to lean in instead of pull back, which is what I used to do, just like retract, puffer fishing. Instead, I've leaned in. And I can tell you actually, as just a random side note, every time I lean in and tell people how I feel better. And the reaction's actually been wonderful because I am particular about who I lean in with. And I cannot encourage you to do that enough. Now, that's kind of the process. And so I encourage you to first of all, please let your therapist, if you're with a therapist, know that this is the loop you feel caught in. And they need something. You need homework. We need to do something differently, because you're not feeling like you're getting any better. Some things have gotten relatively better, but you still feel like it's way too hard. And I don't know if there's medication that we need to change, talk to your psychiatrist, or we just need to let our therapist know and potentially see a different type of therapist, or have our therapist give us different homework, or, focus on different things. We shouldn't feel like we're caught in a loop where it doesn't actually improve. Yes, it's hard in the moment. And I could say, doing this and acting in this different way is really uncomfortable. And once I tap into my emotions, oh my God, I feel like crying more than I used to. Yes, I know that's uncomfortable and difficult, but overall, we should be able to look back like last month, 6 months, and see the change and be like, wow, I am actually doing better. So maybe ask your therapist to look back in your notes from 6 months ago and tell you where you're at so you can see the progress, because we sometimes lose sight. And then the second, let your therapist know that you feel like you're caught in this loop, because if it hasn't actually gotten better and we look back at 6 months and we're like, damn, I feel like I'm in the same place, then that tells us that what we're doing right now isn't working and we need something different. And that doesn't mean anything's wrong with you. We all need different types of therapy at different points in our process. And not talk therapy doesn't work for everybody. It only works for about 60% of people. So that leaves it's 40% of people. So 60% of us need something different. So no judgments there. Okay. I hope that makes sense. I hope that helps. Moving on to question number 4. It says, Kati, what exactly is a quote unquote nervous breakdown? Is that term outdated? When do I know I'm having one, and what should one do? This is a great question. I would say the term nervous breakdown is I wouldn't even say outdated. I would just say not specific. A nervous breakdown essentially means that our mental health isn't doing well at all. It's doing so poorly that we aren't able to do the things we need to do in our life. You could go as far as to say that a nervous breakdown is when our mental health impacts our ability to function, which means it's most likely a diagnosable mental illness. Many people will talk about a nervous breakdown as being like extreme stress. That I think is probably the most common use when it comes to like colloquially, like in conversations, the way people would bring it up is when they're feeling so stressed and overwhelmed with their life that they just can't do anything. Now, I would say that's either like, major depressive disorder or an anxiety disorder, like generalized anxiety disorder or something like that. But it's really just what I would say is just like I think colloquial is the right term. If not, let me know in the comments. But it's like a term that we use that isn't tied to any diagnosis. It's not a term any mental health professional would use, but it's really when we just are impaired. We can't do what we need to do. We are breaking down. We're like, we can't function because of the effects on our mental health, like the way that we're actually experiencing life emotionally or psychologically. And the way to know that you're having one is when you aren't able to do what you need to do in your life. You feel impaired. And I know impaired may seem like a strong word, but it's like, can I do what I want to do socially? Or is my, for example, social anxiety getting in the way of me going out and hanging with my friends? And I miss them, but fuck, I can't do it, right? It's impairing that. Is it impairing my ability to do my job or go to school? Is it impairing my ability to take care of my home, take care of myself? Am I not showering or feeding myself? Is my home a total disaster, right? All those things are impairments in key parts of our ability to function. And if we're not able to do that, I would say that you could say you're having a nervous breakdown, even though that's really not the term I would use. But that's what people usually mean, is that it's like stress, anxiety, overwhelm, so much so that we like can't function. And to me, that's like we have a mental illness that needs to be treated because we can't, our functioning is impaired. Okay, I hope that helps. Final question. Question number 5 says, hey, Kati, how do you cope with parents who are emotionally immature, neglectful, and abusive when you were a child, but they treat their grandchildren entirely differently, aka giving them the childhood that you didn't have? I feel like I was treated as an adult when I was a child, and now a child as an adult. Many thanks. And this one other person says, as an add-on, if they are still bad for you but are good for your children, should you still allow them to be in your life or lives? These are great questions. Now, coping with parents who are emotionally immature, neglectful, or abusive when you were a child, but now treat the grandchildren entirely differently is unfortunately very common. And in some ways, I'm like, thank God, because people change. People can get better. Maybe what was going on for them when they were younger, when you were younger, is no longer going on. Maybe if they were working a lot and super stressed and taking it out on you, maybe they're retired now. Maybe, they've been in their own therapy, probably not, but possibly, and they've worked on that, so they're getting better. There are a couple of ways for us to manage this. Now, first of all, you're going to feel angry, as you should, because why are you different now? Like, you fucked me up as a kid. Like, what? Like, there's a lot of, I would assume, and it's going to be very normal to feel very frustrated, very angry, very resentful. And that's going to be because we can't change other people. Those are all going to be things that we have to process in our own therapy. So I cannot encourage you enough to get into your own therapy and start processing the pain and hurt that you went through. Because if we're able to talk about, to cry about, to get angry about, to process through what took place when we were growing up, then it won't impact us anymore today. Meaning that if we see them acting differently with our children, we're not going to have that emotional charge because we processed it through for ourselves. Now, is that going to take time? You betcha. Is it uncomfortable and suck? Yep, definitely. But it's worth it because it's happening. You're impacted. You're seeing them with your children and you're like, are you fucking serious? Right? They're totally different with the grandchildren. So annoying. What? It can be very triggering, very upsetting, and for good reason. However, that's our past impacting our present. And that means that we have work to do. Does it suck that we have to do the work to heal from the shit they did? Of course. I wish we could make them do it. It's almost like I wish I could make you go clean up your mess, but we can't control other people. And it's okay to be rage-filled. It's okay to want to tell them to fuck off. It's okay to not want them to be around your kids. You get to choose what's best for you and your children. But I really want to encourage you to do the work on yourself, because if we don't process through what happened in the past, it will continue to impact us in the present. And I know you're like, well, it only impacts my relationship with them. That's a fucking lie. If we have a bad relationship with a parent, if we had issues growing up, it impacts everything. It impacts our friendships, our romantic relationships. It impacts how we communicate with people around us, what we'll tolerate, what we won't, how we interact, our reactivity level, all sorts of stuff, our own emotional intelligence, how we process and deal with difficult emotions, our communication strategies. It affects everything, you guys, even how we operate in our work, school or work. It impacts us. And that, I know that fucking sucks, but it's unfortunately the truth. And so coping with it is for us to maybe grieve the childhood we didn't get. Maybe it's a lot of like rage-filled letters that we write and don't send. It's probably a lot of talking it through and crying. Might be some inner child work. I found parts work to be incredibly helpful when it comes to understanding kind of the emotional reactive part of me, like the teen me is what I called her. Maybe it'd be like for you, like the younger version of yourself. Like we're doing any of that work could be incredibly healing and help you let go of those past experiences, knowing that they don't have to live in the present. And as long as they are good to your children, to answer the second piece of the question, if they're good to your children, and this doesn't mean that when you show up, they're nice to your kids and they're shitty to you. If they're still shitty to you, then you get to decide whether or not you even want to engage with that, because you don't have to put up with that and you don't have to bring your children around that. Because even if we're like, oh, but they're nice to the kids, but they're nasty to me, your kids see them treat you that way. They see this in those interactions. We pretend kids like aren't aware. Kids are always aware. They're like sponges for their environment because they're still growing and developing. They're trying to understand nuances of language. And there was even this study I just saw. I don't know if it was on TikTok or Instagram, but it showed a child playing when the parents were like jovial and chitty chatting, and it felt free to, and it was giggling and playing. And then the parents started arguing, or someone came in to argue. I forget if it was the parents or someone who came in, but the child froze and wouldn't engage with the toy, even though the person that was doing the like play therapy with them was the same person. It was engaging in the same way. So even if you're like, well, they're not doing it to the kids know, they hear, they pick it up, and they respond accordingly, and it affects them. So if they're still being shitty to you, that's not a healthy environment to put anybody in. So don't think you have to light yourself on fire so your kids can have grandparents, because that's not a healthy dynamic. Okay? So know that you have every right to not be around them. You have every right to re-engage. You have every right to, if they've improved, for you to work on yourself so that you can be in that scenario. All if you want to still, you get to choose who's in your life, okay? I know people believe like family always gets access. Nobody should always get access. People get access to us if we allow them to, if it's a healthy dynamic, if it's one that's worth having, because overall, no relationship is perfect, but this one is beneficial for all of us, right? Period. So I just want you to consider that. You don't have to allow them in your life if they're shitty to you, because your kids will recognize that. They'll feel that. So maybe, just consider that. It's up to you what you want to do. If you feel like it's best for your kids and that's something that you want to engage with, then we have to work on ourselves so that we can engage in that relationship without it essentially, eating us up inside. I know it's hard. Family's so hard. It can be so painful, but take the time, work on yourself, and then decide what's best for you. Okay? Thank you all so much for listening and watching. Thank you for sending in your questions. Like I said, we'll have one more regular AKA, then we're going to take a break. I'll be posting about this too as reminders so that you don't forget. But we will have one more regular week on a Thursday where we have our question and answer. Basic AKA, we'll take a break, and we are relaunching March 6th with a new type of podcast where I do more interviews with experts, other YouTube creators, other celebrities in the space, learning from them and their experiences. I'm excited to take you guys along on this ride. I'm excited to learn from other people. So stay tuned. I love you all. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Do your homework, and I'll see you next time.